Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good night from whatever part of planet Earth you are joining this second day of the first international workshop of a Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. We have the pleasure to hear with us today Professor Peter Skott. I will make a brief presentation of Professor Peter Skott. Professor Peter Skott is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, since 2003. He was previously a professor at the University of Aarhus from 1987 to 2003. His research interests are macroeconomics and income distribution. He is an associate editor of the Journal Macroeconomica and Economia, published widely in scientific journals such as Cambridge Journal of Economics, Macroeconomica, Structural Change in Economic Dynamics, Journal of PostKeynesians Economics, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Review of Keynesian Economics, among others. He has published two books, Calder's Growth and Distribution Theory, from Peter Lang-Verlag in 1989, and Conflict and Effective Demand in Economic Growth at Cambridge University Press, also in 1989. He was also a researcher of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group, and he is the keynote speaker for today. The title of his presentation will be Aggregate Demand in a Dual Economy. Peter, good morning, and many thanks for have accepted our invitation to be today at our workshop, and the audience is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to present some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. The title of the paper is Aggregate Demand Policy in a Dual Economy, and I think in many ways what I'll be talking about today maybe complements some of the talks that we heard yesterday. It's the same theme, but it's a different angle, and hopefully it will bring something new to the table. So let me start with a bit of motivation. Part of that motivation is, if you want, negative. I think that post-Keynesian theories sometimes can be misleading. Sometimes they may send a message that is potentially dangerous, wrong, and actually, I think, un-Keynesian. Related to that, I think the supply side is important, and I think that is sometimes ignored. The demand side is important too, of course, and had I given this talk to a group of maybe more mainstream orthodox people, I would have stressed the demand side is important here. But if one addresses a more Keynesian structuralist audience, I think it's important to emphasize the supply side angle. So the punchlines, if you want, are quite simple. It is that boosting aggregate demand is not a development strategy. Aggregate demand is important, but it's not just a matter of increasing aggregate demand. It's also that we need to make a clear distinction between structural aggregate demand problems and structural transformation problems. And if you have a structural aggregate demand problem, you may indeed need a sustained stimulus, sustained aggregate demand stimulus, but that is not the case in a developing economy, in a dual economy. Okay, what do I have in mind when I say that some post-Keynesians may send the wrong signal or misleading, a dangerous signal? Well, the post-Keynesian view, if at least part of it, can be characterized by a strong focus on the goods market, almost an exclusive focus on the goods market. Aggregate demand is seen as the driver of growth, and there are no binding supply-side constraints. I don't think this is a caricature. I'm aware, of course, that there are some people who do talk supply side, but I don't think this is a caricature of at least the message that may seem to be sent from the post-Keynesian camp. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate. If you look at Caleskian models of wage-led growth, then it is, if you look at Eckhard Hein or Marc Lavoie's well-known textbooks, it's a defining characteristic that there are no labor or capital constraints in these models. It's aggregate demand that drives economic growth. I think underemployment in dual economies, and dual economies would be the economies where these models would seem to fit best, because in dual economies you have a perfectly elastic labor supply to the modern sector. But even in dual economies, you do not have the absence of supply-side constraints. They're still there. Let me add, and this is sort of an aside to what I will be talking about today, that I think, in fact, it is largely irrelevant whether aggregate demand is wage or profit-led. And I do not understand why it has been given this much attention. Why is it irrelevant? Well, imagine that you found that some desirable shift of income towards wages had a negative impact on aggregate demand. Well, what would you do? You would implement the desirable change in income distribution, and then you would engage in a little bit of expansionary fiscal policy, and voila, problem is solved. So income distribution has many other important effects, including some I'll be talking about today. But whether aggregate demand is wage-led or profit-led, it seems to me, is basically irrelevant. Modern monetary theory, again, advocating expansion of aggregate demand. Employer of last resort programs have been advocated in a number of countries, including, I believe, Argentina, and to some extent maybe implemented. Like Caleskian models, focus on aggregate demand, but perhaps an interesting and striking contrast to the Caleskian models. Unlike these models here, policy now is omnipotent. We can fix anything by just having expansionary fiscal policy as long as we have a sovereign currency. Distribution is seen as a distraction, so rather than saying we need wage-led growth because that's the only way we can influence aggregate demand, the story now is we don't need to worry about progressive taxation or other policies to curb luxury consumption, to address these distributional issues. We can just go ahead and use aggregate demand policy. But again, aggregate demand policy as a driver of growth. Straffi and super multiplier models also see autonomous demand as a driver of long-run growth, no labor constraints. So I think there is evidence that this is the message. I know there may be caveats sometimes if you push people, but these are positions that are widely argued, and these are the positions that I find potentially dangerous, not least in a dual economy context, and that's what I want to talk about today. As a little kind of aside here, I think it's questionable whether in fact these positions are Keynesian or are Caleskian. Keynes did not ignore the supply side. Anyone reading the general theory will realize that. And Kaleski certainly did not either. I have a little quote here where he talks about how unemployment in underdeveloped countries differs fundamentally from unemployment in developed economies. In underdeveloped countries, the underemployment is the result of a shortage of capital. It's not a deficiency of effective demand. So the idea that Kalecki would endorse this aggregate demand is the only driver of economic growth, I think is questionable. That's not important. Kalecki could be wrong. So the real issue, of course, is do we need to look more carefully at the supply side? Okay, so brief overview of what follows. I will first look at a goods market equilibrium in a closed economy, one sector, and then I'll turn to two sector interactions. I think these are important because we need to understand the interactions between sectors to look at relative wages, distributional conflict, and inflation. And I think that is the way that supply-side constraints often manifest themselves. I'll talk very briefly about an open economy extension. That'll be very brief. So in that sense, it's somewhat different from maybe the focus of yesterday's discussion. That's not because the open economy angle is unimportant, but because I think I can make the points that I want to address today, I can make them simpler and more clearly by not moving straight to an open economy version, and then a little bit of conclusion. Let me mention that what I'll be talking about today draws primarily on three articles. So should anyone be interested in some of the arguments or want to see substantiation of some of the claims I'll be making, then hopefully you'll be able to find them there. Okay, the one sector economy. If you take a very simple standard Keynesian model, closed economy, then we have an equilibrium condition that says output equal to consumption plus investment plus government consumption. I have scaled it here. I've divided it through by the capital stock, which obviously is useful if one is going to talk about growth. The I over K, I've rewritten now as G plus delta. G is the growth rate of the economy. If we're thinking of a situation, steady growth path, long run growth path, where we have a constant output capital ratio, then the accumulation rate, the net accumulation rate will be equal to the growth rate of the economy, and that's what I denote by G. Gamma will be my indicator of the ratio of government consumption to capital. That's a contentious issue, political views, ideologies, people differ, how many school teachers, how many police officers should we hire. I'll assume that somehow we have made a decision on the appropriate size of the government sector, on the appropriate size of spending carried out on consumption of goods and services. That has been decided. I don't think we should decide how many police officers we have based on aggregate demand issues, basically. So gamma will be treated basically as a constant that we have determined in one way or another. If you look at this equilibrium condition, so we have a given output capital ratio, think Leontief production function, a utilization rate that is at the desired rate. We don't have persistent deviations from that. Then the left-hand side is given. We've determined gamma. We have a growth rate here. And if you're in a mature economy, and by a mature economy, I mean one whose growth rate is constrained by the growth of the labor force in efficiency units. So that determines G. So gamma, G, delta, sigma, all determined. That means C over K will somehow have to adjust if we want to maintain full employment growth. Now, we can have a problem. If we have a private saving rate that happens to be high, and we have a low natural growth rate, then we may have a structural deficit, a structural aggregate demand problem in the absence of fiscal policy that is expansionary. So what do? Well, you need to adjust taxes. I fix my government spending on goods and services, but you adjust taxes, you give tax cuts that boost private consumption. You'll get debt developing. As debt develops, and that's wealth for the private sector, you'll find consumption increasing, and you may not need to maintain deficits. But however that pans out, and you can examine the dynamics of it, we may need some kind of permanent boost to aggregate demand if you are in a mature economy. Let me add, mature economy does not mean full employment. You can have 10, 15% unemployment in an economy that's mature. It does not mean that the natural growth rate is exogenously given. You can have endogenous productivity growth. You can have Verdorn laws. You can have productivity growth that's related to the employment rate. You can have those endogeneities there. What it means is that there are limits to how much productivity growth or the growth of the labor force in natural units will respond to increases in aggregate demand. As a simple test, think of what would happen in say France if we were to expand output aggregate demand at 10% a year as in China. We might be able to do that, boosting aggregate demand. We might be able to expand output 10% a year for 1 year or maybe 2 years, but it's not something that's sustainable. It's not sustainable to do that in Japan or in the US or in Germany. These economies are mature. Dual economies are not mature. You have a lot of underemployment. You can, for a prolonged period, 20 years, you can grow at 10% without running into labor constraints. Dual economies differ from mature economies in that you do not have the structural aggregate demand problem. If you have high saving, so you were to have a low private consumption to capital ratio, gamma is maybe low, sigma is high, so you have seemingly a deficit, but no, you would want to have high accumulation. You would want to have G be as high as possible because you want to achieve the transformation of the economy. You want to draw people from the low productivity sectors into the modern sector. What you have is a structural transformation problem, and that is very different. So how should one conduct functional finance? Functional finance is the term I've been using for it. I probably should, in this context, maybe I should refer to it as the structuralist, development macroeconomic policy. Functional finance in a dual economy. How should we conduct fiscal policy so as to achieve the structural transformation that we want? Well, you first need to figure out what is a suitable target accumulation rate. We would like it to be as high as possible, but we need to be aware of the fact that there is a growth consumption trade-off. There is a supply side. We have a modern sector that is constrained by the available capital stock. If we want to grow very fast, we have to squeeze consumption of modern sector output. I'll assume that it's the modern sector that produces the investment goods. So you have this trade-off, and that means, of course, you don't just go as fast as you possibly could. But once you've decided, once you've balanced this growth consumption trade-off, you then need to make sure that you create the space for this investment. If you want high accumulation rate, then you need to somehow have low consumption. If we treat public consumption, the number of policemen and the number of teachers and health workers, whatever, if we treat that as having been decided through some debate, political debate, we've decided that, then what is left is regulating tax rates. If we want a high growth rate, we'll now have to squeeze private consumption we would need to have high taxes, we get public sector surplus, and we get low debt or maybe even negative debt. So fast accumulation would typically be associated with not large deficits and high debt, but the opposite. It's not enough to just make the space for investment. You need to ensure incentives for the modern sector to actually fill that space, to actually carry out the private investment. If you rely on private investment, which most economists do, and that's probably a reasonable thing, not to have complete dominance of the public sector in the investment decision. So you want to give the private sector the incentives to carry out the investment. That means there's a very important role for policy at just stabilizing demand. You don't want very volatile demand for modern sector output. You want to stabilize it, have it grow along the target growth path that you've decided on. It's not enough just to have the growth rate of aggregate demand following the target. You also need to make sure that profitability is sufficient to actually give the incentive for the private sector to carry out the investment. So profitability of the modern sector becomes a concern, and that in an open economy context, that's why I put it in brackets, because I'm not going to talk an awful lot about it, leads back to the competitive real exchange rate, which was a recurrent theme in yesterday's presentations. Okay, so this was all within the confines of a one sector model. But if you're talking dual economy, then I think it is useful in some ways and sometimes absolutely critical to disaggregate and to look at the two sectors explicitly, to look at their interactions. So my very simple stylized two sector economy here will have a formal modern sector. It'll look just like what I showed you before in terms of the one sector economy. It'll have a Leontief production function. There'll be markup pricing. Then there'll be an informal traditional sector. It'll use only labor input. That's sort of a stylized version of the informal sector being less capital intensive than the formal sector. And it'll be the residual employer in inverted commas, because it's probably not so much employers and wage labor you find there, but in many cases, sort of self-employment, street vendors, whatever. So whoever doesn't get a job in the modern sector will kind of move into the informal sector, try to make a living one way or the other. Equations, just quickly: the formal sector, Leontief, and utilization at the desired rate. This is very much a long run, medium long run story. It's a story about development. I'll assume that we carry out our fiscal policy so as to stabilize the economy around the trajectory that we wanted to follow. So we have, if need be, through policy, we have aggregate demand adjusting so that output is equal to sigma k, where sigma represents this utilization, this output capital ratio at the desired utilization rate. And of course, that is equal to lambda times Lm, where Lm is employment in the modern sector, subscripts indicating sector, and lambda is the labor productivity. We have a definitional relation between the profit share and the product real wage. So the product real wage in the modern sector is equal to lambda times 1 minus the profit share, pi indicating the profit share. Informal sector, we have the residual employer story. So the number of workers in the informal sector equal to the total labor supply minus Lm minus the number of workers who find work in the modern sector. And Lm, of course, is determined by K. If you have a predetermined capital stock, aggregate demand policy ensures that it's being utilized, so the capital stock determines how many workers get drawn into the modern sector, and then the rest of them would go into the informal sector. Average income in the informal sector is demand determined. So we have, if A is real output in the informal sector, I don't, given the way I later on specify the demand structure, I don't actually need to say anything specific about the production function, but you can think of it. There's no harm in thinking of it as just a constant returns to labor, but where you may have underemployment. So if U is the unemployment rate in the informal sector, 1 minus U is the number of people who are effectively employed, then this would be a production function, and A is now given if we know U and we know LA, and then PA would be determined by aggregate, by the total demand for informal sector goods. Divide through by LA and you have the average income in the informal sector. And that'll turn out to be an important variable because workers in the formal sector get a wage, and that wage has to be certainly higher than the average income in the informal sector. Otherwise, workers would not want to move to the formal sector. But there may be a tighter constraint than that. I'll return to that later. So demand determined average income in terms of formal goods. Demand side, I'll assume that all wage income is spent on consumption. There will be taxes on formal sector wages, no taxes on informal sector incomes. That's sometimes seen as almost a definitional aspect of informality. Capital income is being taxed too. Again, I don't need to specify exactly how it's being taxed. It could be taxed at a proportional tax rate that's different or the same as the tax rate on formal wages, or it could be taxed in different ways. That doesn't matter, and I haven't specified it here. So we have total consumption by workers plus consumption out of profits, and this here is total after-tax income, wage income, and this here is still consumption out of profit income. We have investment that is equal to G plus delta times K. We have the growth rate that we set target for. And if we want output to grow at that rate with a constant output capital ratio, then this is the amount of investment. And here is my government consumption. Okay, what about the composition of demand? Well, I'll assume that investment consists entirely of modern sector goods. What about consumption? I'll assume that is both private and public consumption is split, so that a constant share of consumption goes to the informal sector, and the constant share, the other part of it goes towards the formal sector. And that gives equilibrium conditions. Here's for the informal sector. So total income in the informal sector equal to aggregate demand, total demand for informal sector goods, which is equal to total consumption, private and public, multiplied by 1 minus alpha. So that's the share of consumption going to informal sector goods. The share alpha is going to formal sector goods. So the demand for formal sector goods equal to alpha times consumption, total consumption, plus investment. Only investment uses only modern sector goods. These are straightforward equilibrium conditions. I'm now going to first point out an asymmetry that I already mentioned, but it's important. We have an M sector with a capital constraint. So with a given capital stock, that determines output in the formal sector. It also determines employment in the formal sector. The A sector may have an elastic supply. There's underemployment, or it may have flexible prices. if you treat underemployment as either zero or if you treat it as something that is constant. Either way, the average income in the informal sector is determined by demand. I can use the two equilibrium conditions for the A&M sector to now derive an expression for relative wages. I'll talk about relative wages. That's a shorthand in the informal sector. It may not be formal wages, but just average incomes. What is this ratio? Well, given that there's taxes in the formal sector, then I need to, if I want to disposable income, the real income that workers have left, I need to have omega A, omega M, but I need to, of course, adjust for the taxation of formal sector incomes. And you can now derive this equation. I won't do it here, but what you have is the output capital ratio, you have the target growth rate, depreciation rate, and then you have demand composition parameters, and you have tax rates, you have the income distribution, and then here you have a term in K, and that's basically a measure of the size of the formal sector. So as you develop, as workers move into the formal sector, the ratio of formal sector employment to total labor force would go up, and this would be rising non-linearly as G goes up. So what this says is that as you develop, as you grow, then the wage premium, this here is an inverse measure of the wage premium. The wage premium declines. You get relative wages in the formal sector going up. You get duality gradually being reduced. You get a move towards greater equality in terms of incomes across sectors. But of course, that process can only go to a certain extent. At some point, we'll reach maturity, and certainly maturity will have been reached once the wages are the same, once the incomes are the same in the two sectors. So we need to impose this condition as something that clearly has to be satisfied. However, we may need something in the real world. We may need something stronger than this. Why is that? And that brings me to an issue that puzzled me for a long time, and that's the observation that inflationary pressures occur, and they occur in developing economies, even though there may be a very high wage premium in the M sector, and there's significant underemployment. In those contexts, a sort of standard labor market story would seem to suggest that there should be no pressures. You have lots of unemployment. You have a high wage premium in the modern sector. Why would you see wage pressures happening in the cost push pressures happening in the modern sector? And I think the answer to that puzzle, at least the answer that at the moment I find most convincing, is that the wage setting in the modern sector is driven by path-dependent wage norms. So you have markup pricing, and you may or may not have a fixed profit share. In the simple version, you may have a fixed profit share. I'll later on relax that. But you have markup pricing, and then you have wage setting influenced by these path-dependent wage norms. So if you violate a wage norm, if you squeeze wages below what modern sector workers consider fair, then you would get cost push inflation. Now, path-dependent wage norms. Well, let me try to illustrate what I have in mind by first a simple thought experiment. Imagine that you're paid $20 an hour. And this seems fair. You've been getting $20 an hour for as long as you can remember, and that seems to be a fair wage. You're happy. Then, unexpectedly, you get a pay rise to 25. You hadn't thought that was going to happen, but it seems okay. You're obviously worth more than 25, more than $20. You get 25 now. What's your reaction? Well, you'll be very happy, and then probably you would relatively soon get used to the idea that yes, I'm worth 25. That adjustment is not hard to make. It's much harder to go around thinking, look, I'm only worth fair. I'm only worth 20. That is what is fair. I'm being paid 25. I ought to be grateful. That's something that would quickly get eroded, and you start feeling, yeah, 25 is what is fair. So if after a few years your employer comes back to you and tells you, oh, that was a mistake, you know, I shouldn't have given you 25. You actually, the fair wage is 20. Then my suggestion is that most of us would think that is grossly unfair. We would have adjusted our notions of fairness to thinking that 25 is fair. If wage is kept at 20 for a long time, we may gradually, grudgingly start thinking of that as yeah, okay, that's what it is, that's fair. Our notions of fairness are path dependent, and that's not a new discovery. I've found a couple of quotes here. I could have found many other from Keynes and Marshall and lots of other people. But Marx, back in Capital Volume 1, is quite clear that if we talk the value of labor power, then there's a strong historical and moral element. Or I love this Hicks quote, when he says in his Crisis in Keynesian Economics book, he talks about the system of wages should be well established. Why? Well, then it gets the sanction of custom. It becomes what is expected, and what is expected is fair, at least at this low level of fairness. Psychologists, behavioral economists have recently emphasized the same thing. Here's a quote by Kahneman, and I think it's just very well established. If you look up any social psychology book, you'll find it. So what does that mean? If you have these path-dependent wage norms, the fact that they're path-dependent means that they can change endogenously, but it takes a while for them to change. So what you can get is gradual reductions in the wage premium without necessarily sparking hyperinflation, explosive inflationary processes. But if you get large and rapid shifts in relative incomes, then you violate the wage norms and you start a process where cost push will increase wages, that increases prices in the modern sector. And then you have the demand-determined incomes in the informal sector. They rise proportionally. So you don't adjust the unfairness. And that's what can generate this vicious, explosive process. Okay, so functional finance or structuralist macroeconomic development policies in a dual economy set the target for the growth rate, but now observe that there are really two conditions that you should keep in mind. You need to make space for accumulation. You need to make sure that you kind of squeeze consumption enough so that you don't get just excess demand in the goods market, which would either lead to a demand pull inflation, or if in an open economy would lead to maybe unsustainable balance of payments deficit. So you need to make space for accumulation, but you also need to pay attention to relative wages. You need to think of the inflation constraint, and that should factor into your economic policy. Making space for accumulation, well, that's exactly the same as what I talked about in the one sector framework. There's no change in this. So if we fixed our target growth rate, we have our output capital ratio in the modern sector, and then we have gamma. That means we somehow have to squeeze consumption either either the consumption by capitalists or the consumption by workers here. So adjust taxes and public spending to make the equilibrium condition here satisfied when G is equal to the target rate. It also, to repeat, means that if you have high growth, then that would typically be associated with low deficits or even surpluses on the public sector account, and low public debt. The inflation constraint. Well, if we have a path-dependent, some kind of ratio of relative incomes that is considered fair, and we need to keep the wage premium at least at that level, so we can now depict the inflation constraint as the relative wage of informal sector workers has to be below this threshold. You can now see that if this is a binding constraint, and if you were to increase G, then you'll have to do something. It was a binding constraint, and now you are increasing G, and that will require an adjustment in taxes. So populist temptations. You come into power, you would like to please everybody. It's tempting to promise too much. You have a growth target that's ambitious, but you don't want to engage in the unpopular task of reducing consumption, of raising taxes on any group. So you get this unsustainable policy, either excess demand in a closed economy and inflation, demand pull, or balance of payment problems that may balloon. But you may even get problems after a sufficient squeeze if it's the wrong composition. Let's assume you don't want to squeeze the rich, so you start squeezing the poor being the workers in the formal sector. So you raise taxes on the workers, but that means you now violate the no inflation constraint. You had boosted demand maybe initially, and that would tend to increase incomes in the informal sector. You offset that now by reducing after-tax incomes in the formal sector. What you end up with is a potentially significant violation of the inflation constraint, and the result would be cost push inflation that can take hold. So what you need to do is to keep that inflation firmly in mind, and maybe use taxes on luxury goods, actually confront the entrenched interest of the rich, of the elite. Use taxes on luxury goods or profits as a way to squeeze not workers, but instead squeeze the rich. Yeah. Open economy extension, quickly. If only the modern sector good is tradable, which is a reasonable assumption, if we have a binding balance of payments constraint, which as a long run growth assumption may not be too horrible, then the equilibrium conditions for the two sectors are unchanged. If we now assume an exogenous foreign currency price of the tradable good, so a perfectly elastic demand for tradable goods, that means that the markup has to become endogenized. If firms in the modern sector raise their prices above the international good prices in common currency, then they would sell nothing. So endogenous markup in the modern sector, and we can now have modern sector accumulation. We endogenize that by making it a function of the profit share. These are very simple, stylized assumptions. I don't think they're crazy. But let me just add that you can actually get similar results to what I'm going to do now. You can get those by relaxing these assumptions significantly. I won't say you can get the results for any assumptions you make, but you can relax these assumptions significantly. If you make these assumptions, it's relatively easy to draw out a scenario that I think has some relevance. Assume that you have initially growth at the target rate, and that corresponds to having profitability that is at the rate that actually generates. Remember that G was a function of the profit share. So if you want to achieve this, that tells you that you need to have profitability at a particular level. Right? GT is given, then pi t is given. So that's where you are initially. You're growing along nicely. Then, triggered by a commodity boom or a new party that is engaging in populist policies, you get a positive shock to demand, and that leads to a violation of the inflation constraint. Okay, what could happen in this situation? Well, either you get inflation, or you have inflation targeting central banks. They engage in monetary tightening, you get an appreciating currency. In either case, whether through inflation or appreciating currencies, you will get a profit squeeze in the modern sector. What does that mean? That means accumulation rates fall. So now you get deindustrialization happening as a result of either the commodity boom or just the populist policies. It's easy if you include some dynamic increasing returns to scale in the modern sector, then it's easy to construct development traps. There are lots of models of that, and it's not hard to construct them, and they're relevant. And what it means is that as a result of this commodity boom or populist policies, falling accumulation rates, you may actually get the modern sector shrinking, so that you fall into the development trap. So even when the commodity boom is over, you're still stuck there, and a temporary boom has led to a long-term decline. I would suggest that this simple story has a number of applications, and maybe we can talk about those later. So, I've been told that I need to wrap up, and I'll do that. The general theme of this talk has been that both the supply and demand sides are important. We should not ignore the demand side the way a lot of mainstream or most mainstream theories do, but we should not ignore the supply side the way that some post-Keynesian theories seem to do either. Second theme, the policy problems are different in mature and dual economies. Mature economies may suffer, not all of them do, but they may suffer from a structural aggregate demand problem. Dual economies suffer from structural transformation problems. A high accumulation rate is desirable, but there's a modern sector supply constraint. If you engage in sensible aggregate demand policies, I've called it functional finance, but maybe it should be called structuralist development macroeconomic policy. You want to make space for the high investment, and you want to pay close attention to wage norms and cost push inflation, which means that typically if you are ambitious, if you want to grow fast and maybe also be egalitarian in the way you do it, then you need to confront entrenched interest, you need to confront the elite and luxury consumption. Long-run aggregate demand policy is important. Short-run stabilization policy is essential. I haven't talked about it. I've just assumed it was carried out. But boosting aggregate demand is not a long-term development strategy. And I think some post-Keynesian models may strengthen dangerous populist temptations. They may send the wrong message, even if proponents of the models might be willing to introduce various caveats in their discussion of these policies. I'm out of time, and I see the stern look of Professor Orero, so I will stop here and say thank you. Shall I try to stop
my
sharing?
microphone now. Thanks, Peter, so much for your nice presentation. I think that the topic that you cover is very interesting, but I have some comments about your presentation. Two comments, basically. The first one, when you analyzing the dual economy, you defined a target rate of accumulation. Well, this problem of targeting the rate of accumulation was addressed by classical development theory or Latin American structuralism by the idea that a large share of the investment ratio would have to be done either by state-owned enterprises or directly by government, because in low income countries like Brazil or Argentina in the 50s or 60s, the problem was not the lack of savings, but lack of incentives for investment, for private investment. So in order to achieve a target rate of accumulation, what you need is the government to execute not an aggregate demand expansion, but to execute a large program of public investments or state-owned enterprise investments. So here in Latin America, for 2 or almost 3 decades, we done what Keynes suggested in his general theory, which is the socialization of investment. I think that in order to achieve a target rate of accumulation, investment must be state-led. So that's my first observation. Well, my second observation is regarding the model. You separate 2 sectors, the modern sector and the subsistence sector, but you assume that the wages in the income distribution in the modern sector is determined in a Calaxian way. All right. If we return to Liu's 1954 paper, when he introduces the subsistence sector, he said that the labor force on the subsistence sector acts as a pool of large people that can be employed by the modern sector. So the wage in the modern sector will be equal to the wage in subsistence sector plus a premium due for more harder worker conditions on the modern sector, but is real wage in the modern sector is constant, which means that when you transfer labor from subsistence sector to the modern sector, you increase average productivity of labor, of course, because you are transferring people from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. And so you are increasing average productivity, but without increasing wages. This means that the profit share is not constant in the modern sector, is increasing over time. And if we make the traditional Calder-Pazinetti assumption that propensity to save out of profits is higher than propensity to save out of wages, what will occur is that the saving rate will increase over time. So for Liu's original model, there is no worry about the saving rate, because the saving rate adjusts endogenously to the rate of growth of the modern sector. But in Haus Prebisch work, he is very concerned about the luxury consumption of the upper classes in Latin America. But his theory is basically the same of Liu's. Of course, that he knows that the structural transformation increases the average productivity, and increasing the average productivity, you redistribute profits from income from wages to profits, which means an increase in profit share. So why how Prebisch is worried about the luxury consumption of the upper classes? Mainly because the luxury consumption of the upper classes will increase imports, and this will tight the external constraint. So the recommendations of ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, was to design a tax system in order to destimulate the luxury consumption of the upper classes, because this will contain imports and then soft the external constraint. So I think that the things that you consider in your model regarding the possible overheating of the economy will be more clearly established in an open economy model instead of a closed economy model. That's my comments.
Should I respond now?
Yes, you can respond.
I think you raise incredibly important questions, and on the first one, I don't think we disagree. It's something that I didn't talk about because I had to limit myself in various ways. But public investment has traditionally been extremely important, and that's the case whether it's public investment in sort of standard, I don't know, typically private sectors like steel and stuff. I mean, if you look at Korea and Japan, you'd find significant direct public activity as they moved into new sectors. And then in some cases, in most cases, I guess those initially sort of state-owned or state-operated activities were privatized. So that's one area where yes, you may need to have government direct intervention in the investment process. But of course, even more important, or at least as important, is the public investment in everything from infrastructure to education to health systems to, without the public sector doing that, the private sector would be at a serious disadvantage. These public investments are complementary to what the private sector may be able to do. So yes, I did not talk about the composition of investment and who should do what, but I am in absolute total agreement with you if you want to stress that there is a role for public investment. The one little thing that this implication this has for some of what I said is that if you have a very large part of the investment being carried out by the public sector, then you may actually see a fast-growing economy having deficits. I mentioned that as a general rule, if you're fast growing, you would typically not run big public sector deficits, and you would instead maybe even see surpluses, and you'd get low public debt. But if the government carries out a lot of the investment, then that becomes ambiguous. So that's the one direct effect on what I said. Aside from that, I don't really feel that I have the expertise to talk clearly about exactly what should the government be doing and what should not be done. Industrial policy is incredibly important, but it probably should be often tailored to the specific circumstances. You don't want to just copy what Korea did and then expect that it works in Paraguay. It may not. So I think the details of how the industrial policy should be carried out and how what should be invested in is something that requires much more study than I've given it. On the model, yes, you're certainly right that the Lewis model is very different, and you're also right that the early structuralist models are different from what I present. But I guess I'll stick to my guns. I don't think the Lewis model gives an accurate description of what we see. I mean, we don't see that the equality of incomes across informal and urban sectors. So the simple equality there does not hold. The stylized facts, at least as I know, I mean, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but the stylized facts are that workers in the formal sector are significantly better off, and that informal sector workers would, almost all of them, they would be thrilled to get formal sector jobs. So you don't have the Lewis equality. And you don't have either, as far as I can tell, a kind of fixed wage premium that somehow doesn't change over time. I think the wage premium in the formal sector does change, and I think there are these historical and inertial influences, that there are these wage norms, and I think you do see wage push in the formal sector if you violate those. And that happens even if you have a high wage premium and you have lots of unemployment. I may be wrong. I mean, most of you, I can't see who's in the audience, but most of you undoubtedly know a lot more about Brazil and Latin America than I do. But my limited sort of reading of the evidence and my understanding of it is that we need some story that includes these path-dependent wage norms. Why do firms give in? Well, they give in because if you have workers who feel they're unfairly treated, then they're not as productive. So you can have that profit maximizing firms may actually be willing to acquiesce to some of these wage demands, because otherwise they will be subject to strikes, or they'll be subject to just workers who are less motivated and don't work as hard. So I think for me the stylized facts suggest that Lewis was a good starting point, but it's not accurate. And I think going back to the early structuralist models, I think, at least with my limited understanding, a lot of that literature is not available in English, and so I'm a little bit disadvantaged there. But what I have read seems to suggest a focus very much on agricultural supply constraints as sources of inflation, and those are essential consumption goods. And I don't think that captures the informal sector today. I mean, that's more of an urban service sector. It's not essential input. It's not essential consumption goods. So the inflation story needs to get rethought, which maybe it has by other people as well. But this is my suggestion that I presented here. Okay, let me stop here. I could waffle for a long time about this. But let me
All right, we have another question from the audience, and but I ask you to answer briefly because we are running out of time. It's from Daniel Peroso. Professor Skott, excellent presentation. Besides inflationary issues, what are the consequences of the second set of populist policies presented? Is inflation the only one?
I'm not sure I understand. There was a sentence I missed. What are the consequences?
I will put on your chat. I put on the private chat so you can read it.
second set of populist policies. The second set of populist policies was those were the ones where you had a bad composition of taxes. Is that correct? Yeah. Well, if you meet the overall kind of if you create the space, then you don't get automatically kind of balance of payments deficits, and you don't get the demand pull. But if you have not paid attention to the inflation constraints, to the income distribution constraints, then you may get inflation. You could also get all kinds of other political effects, obviously, from strikes and unhappiness with public policies to military coups. I don't know. I'm not sure which way you may be thinking of this. I guess my second set of the populist policies, or what are the second? Well, I mean, okay, there are benign consequences if you want. I mean, obviously you can if you improve the incomes of some of the really poor in the informal sector, then you would say that's a wonderful implication of it. But you need to be aware that if you do that, then you may create inflationary pressures. So, and that's what I was in a sense emphasizing here. So I think what that suggests is that you want to think of how you improve the living conditions of the really poor. And one way of thinking about that would be to, rather than having cash support, which I think has become increasingly popular in development policies. So either getting cash support to the poor, if you could improve sanitation systems or public transport or access to internet in areas that are disadvantaged, then you may actually achieve some of the income distribution or welfare distribution without having the same kind of inflationary consequences. I'm not sure I've answered your question, because I'm not sure I know exactly what you're after. But I think once you start thinking about inflation constraints, you would realize that there are multi-dimensions to both the kind of tax policies and income distribution policies that could be implemented, and they may not have the same effects on inflation.
All right, people, many thanks, Peter. I'm worried that we are just run out of time. Many thanks for your presentation, for accepting to deliver a keynote speech at the second day of our workshop. And I expect to see you soon as possible when this COVID-19 ends. I have taken my first shot of AstraZeneca, and my wife take her first shot of Pfizer. So I believe that at the end of August, we are both immunized, having the second shot. So people, many thanks for everyone. Now we will have 5 minutes virtual break before the next presentation. Peter, bye-bye, and see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.